Good evening. Welcome. How are you all doing? Good. That was pretty weak. How are you all doing? Good. There we go. My name is Tony Frost, and I look after the Applied Innovation Exchange here in New York for Capgemini. So, Capgemini, for those of you who don't know, is a global innovation management consulting and technology services firm. And this is an event run by our Applied Innovation Exchange here in New York. This is one of 15 exchanges worldwide. And we do a lot of things, helping clients essentially navigate the world of innovation, introducing them to new ideas, to new technologies, and to things that might help them advance their business. And this program, what we call What's Now, is part of that effort to build a community of knowledge and understanding, what we think of as sort of an ecosystem of people who are thinking at the leading edge of their profession, what we think of as the Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 as opposed to Horizon 1, which is the business and technology of today. And what we like to ask people to do who are speaking in this series is not give a speech that they've given 20 times over the last 3 or 4 years that's been filmed maybe at a famous conference and everybody's already streamed it online, but to tell us about the latest thinking, the work that they're about to do, the ideas that they've just come up with and are advancing out into the world. And so we do these events more or less monthly at this point. You're at our second, since this exchange is new, and we'll be doing it all throughout next year. So if you enjoyed your experience tonight, please feel free to sign up and come back to future events. And please also understand that this is meant to be an exchange. So we don't try to have things be too formal in this context. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them when we get to the Q&A. Please feel free to hang around later. There's plenty of wine, cheese, and other things downstairs where we'll do our little reception afterwards and continue this conversation. And with that, I'd like to first just point out there are lots of Capgemini folks who are around to answer any questions. In the back is Lanny Cohen, who's our Chief Technology and Innovation Officer. Wave your hand. Downstairs, Bob Schwartz, who leads operations for the Applied Innovation Exchange. And for those of you in the room, you can turn around, you can see those are the people sitting downstairs in our overflow space where we're live streaming. And Samantha Burden is also downstairs, who's the ambassador for the Applied Innovation Exchange in New York. And there's lots of other people from our firm throughout. So if you see anybody wearing one of the dorky badges and you have any questions, please feel free to come grab us. And now I'd like to introduce Pete Leiden, who is our partner from Reinvent, and he's going to MC our event this evening.
Thank you. No, I'm wired. You got it. Thank you very much. I'm Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinvent. I'm a media company in San Francisco. And the roots of this series go back into San Francisco, where Capgemini, when they opened up an innovation exchange in San Francisco about 2 years ago, really started to talk to us about what's the best way to really kind of give back to the community, but also to kind of stimulate new thinking and bring together a really interesting network. And that's what we started with this What's Now San Francisco, which has been going for 2 years. It's an awesome gathering. Every month we go to one field, often around a new technology, but not always, an innovative field that's really just going through big changes. And what we do is we find a remarkable person or persons who can kind of explain what's going on in that field to smart folks outside of that field, can talk about the importance of what's happening there, and also start speculating and thinking about how this could play out in the future. And it's always with an idea of how do we figure out better ways forward? How do we actually figure out a way to actually make these technologies, these new innovations, all these new fields kind of layer out in a way that would actually make the world a lot better place? And so it's kind of got a kind of mission side to this gathering. And so when we expand out here, as you just mentioned, did one last month, and now we're basically here for number 2. We want to build a similar network out here. The beauty of what happens is it's not just the folks who speak, but it's an invite-only crowd in San Francisco, and we're hoping to do it here, where everybody who comes in has a little piece of the puzzle. Everybody is an innovator. Everyone has something going on that actually helps shed light on what we could do with these technologies, these new spaces, these new fields, and actually play it out in the near-term future here. And so it's with that we're actually going to be doing it tonight. And tonight is a perfect triple whammy on this exact kind of what's now lens in many respects. It's doubling, you could say, as the New York launch of a new book. designing reality here, and it is essentially designing reality, how to survive and thrive in the third digital revolution. It's by the Gershenfeld brothers. I'll introduce in a second here. But from the what's now lens, what we're looking at is essentially a field of fabrication, in which is essentially a field that's undergoing huge changes, has tons of potential, and is reaching a place where it could really scale. And so what we've got here is one of the authors here, Neil Gershenfeld, is really the perfect person to set up what's really happening in that field. He is the director of MIT's Center for Bits and Atoms. He's considered kind of the intellectual father of the maker movement. He's actually one of the founders that kind of has spawned these Fab Labs, which is now up to about 1,200 all over the world. And so there's a lot, not really a better person that can actually explain what the heck is happening in this space and what's the potential. But on the other hand, we want to talk about the importance of this new technology and what it could really do, and also the issues around it, potentially things that might cause concern. And with that, we've got, this is where the other two authors come in. We've got Alan Gershenfeld, who basically is the president and co-founder of Eline Media. And we also have Joel Kutcher Gershenfeld, who is essentially a prophet at Brandeis University, and he's in the Heller School of Social Policy and Management. And those two brothers are essentially trying to react off or build off, like you could say, Neil's kind of understanding of the technology and really think about the social and policy implications. And because of that, we've got a kind of a double whammy here. The three of them are going to do here, we're going to present a little bit, particularly starting with Neil, laying out the science and technology and where it could go, which I think is going to be exciting for a lot of folks. And then Alan and Joel are going to come in as well and talk a little bit about all these implications. And then what we're going to do, I'm going to slide back in. We're going to start a conversation not just with the three of them, but also with all of you. And we're going to also be trying to integrate the folks from down below. This is being live streamed out into the world. It's other places are watching as well. And later we're going to edit this and get it up in video all over the place. And for that reason, you all are part of this conversation. So when you do actually talk, step up, explain who you are a little bit, and give your ideas and questions as well. So it's not an audience, it's actually a participatory conversation. That's the way we like to think about it here. And so with that, let's bring up the three brothers, Joel, Alan, and Neil. And start with the first phase where Neil starts to lay out the technology.
Great. It's a pleasure to have turned my microphone on. I'm going to do 50 years in 20 minutes. And it's really a pleasure to do it just looking around with so many friends of mine and friends of theirs all brought together. So this was a review in Science of the new book. And I'm going to do opportunity. And then they're going to do challenge, which I think is a pretty good representation of who we each are. So there's been a digital revolution in communication. There's been a digital revolution in computation. There's a digital revolution in fabrication happening now. That's what we're here for. And by the way, if you're taking pictures, I'll send a link to everything I present. We're here to talk about this and how it relates to those revolutions. This is the most famous graph in history. Gordon Moore, in 1964, plotted the number of transistors on an integrated circuit. And on a linear graph, it looked like nothing was happening. But if you take the logarithm, which measures doubling, they lined up in a straight line. And so he said, what if it continues for 10 years? And he wrote this amazing article, cramming more components onto integrated circuits. So that would suggest something big was going to happen around 1970. What happened around 1970 was this was the first personal computer, the Altair. When it first came out, the killer app was you would flip switches to load a binary program, and then the binary lights would blink. That was it, killer app. On that machine, two people started a company called Micro-Soft, Gates and Ballmer. And when this computer came out, it prompted the first meeting of a homebrew computer club with two people named Jobs and Wozniak. A whole generation got started on that. So that was 70, this point. Gordon Moore was wrong. It actually went for 50 years. The doubling carried for 50 years, internet, digital revolution in everything. It started rolling off around 2015. Those ideas came from, at heart, these two people, Shannon and von Neumann. They taught us how to communicate and compute reliably with unreliable devices. And so digital means much more than ones and zeros. It means it's a scaling property. As you linearly increase the physical resources, the error goes down exponentially fast, which means unreliable devices can work reliably. Phone calls got worse with distance. We now have the internet. Computers got worse with time. You now have a supercomputer in your pocket. That's the ideas behind it. This book is about this graph. This is the number of Fab Labs. I'll explain what they are. This is 10 years of the doubling of Fab Labs. There's now more data than Gordon Moore had when he made his prediction. And so we're here tonight to ask, what if this graph carries on for 50 years? What happens to 50 years of scaling that performance? So here's data point number one. In 1952, MIT made the first numerically controlled milling machine. This was the first, an offshoot of the first real-time computer. Jet aircraft needed parts that were hard to make by hand. The computer could turn the cranks on the machine. That was the birth of computerized machining. I run a lab today, Center for Bits and Atoms, that the proposal we wrote that was funded thanks to all of you from NSF was I wanted one of every machine to make anything. And sort of got NSF on a good day, and that's what we run. So I have all these machines, but I had a problem. It would take a whole career to learn to use each of them. So I started a class, well, first to do the research, we did things like among the first quantum computers, and we're part of a collaboration to make the first synthetic cells, and birth of what's called Internet of Things. And one of my students runs all the computing infrastructure for Facebook. Jason, another built Twitter's computing, Rafi. Those are the things that came out of doing this work. But to learn to do it, I started this class called How to Make Almost Anything, which was just that. It was aimed at a few research students to make stuff. And every time I teach it, hundreds come in begging, like, can I take it? They would say, this seems too useful. Are you allowed to teach it at MIT? And they would do the most amazing things. This was a web browser for parrots. Parrots have the cognitive ability of a young child. They go crazy left home alone. Alarm clock you wrestle with, a dress that defends personal space. One of the stars the first year was Kelly, and this was her class project.
Hi, I'm Kelly, and this is my scream body. Do you ever find yourself in a situation where you really have to scream, but you can't because you're at work, or you're in a classroom, or you're watching your children, or you're in any number of situations where it's just not permitted? Well, Scream Body is a portable space for screaming. When a user screams into Scream Body, their scream is silenced. But it is also recorded for later release, where, when, and how the user chooses.
Yeah. I'll pass that on to Kelly, not me. That happened so consistently year after year, I got the students were answering a question I didn't ask. I was asking how to do digital fabrication. They were asking why. And they were showing that the killer app is personal fabrication. So the background is the Whirlwind, the computer's descendant who ran the milling machine, was transistorized as the TX, the first transistorized computer. That was commercialized as the PDP by Ken Olsen that became digital, that started the whole mini computer industry, that created the internet, video games, word processing, all of that. This is Ken Olsen famously saying, nobody needs a computer at home. Little backstory, but that's what he said. When PCs came, it killed the mini computer industry. They failed to make the transition to personal. That's the moment we're at today. The point of digital fabrication is it enables personal fabrication, which is not mass production. It's production for a market of one person. So I'm going to start running forward now to the 50 years. Data point one of those. Today, there's about 1,000 Fab Labs. I'll tell you what they are. There were about 1,000 mini computers. And 1,000 is an interesting number. That's the number of cities on Earth. There's roughly one Fab Lab per city. And the mini computer started out costing $100,000, weighed about 2 tons, and filled a room. And that's exactly the specs of a Fab Lab, $100,000, 2 tons, and fills a room. There's about 1,000 of them now. This is what's in them. We began this as outreach from my lab at MIT, setting up mini versions of the $1 million research tools. So there's the 3D printer, but many people are surprised to hear that's actually one of the least used tools. It's all digital fabrication, computers controlling machines, but it's 10 other processes by which a computer controls a machine to make stuff. And once you have all of this, you can make all of this: boats, bicycles, furniture, consumer electronics, production tooling, all the things you buy you can make. And this is where they are. I opened one, and then it led to 2, and then 4 to 8, and there's now over 1,000 doubling time year and a half. So quick tour. Blair runs one in inner city Detroit. He's buying up empty blocks of the city, and one of his products is transforming the life of at-risk youth, and he's doing sustainable production of a number of things in inner city Detroit. Amazing lab with the Cook Inlet Tribal in Alaska, Alaska Native community, fabulous cultural traditions, but serious problems of alcoholism, unemployment, suicide, amazing crafts and materials. And so this is merging traditional crafts and materials with modern digital fabrication. This is one in the Northern Ireland at the Protestant Catholic boundary at what they call the Peace Wall, which is the war wall, where kids from both sides come together and collaborate in the lab. This is one we did in Bhutan. That's Tshering Tobgay, the really thoughtful prime minister. Bhutan is based on gross national happiness, not gross domestic product. Not how much do you make, but does it make you happy? But they live on crap trucked in from India. And so this brings gross happiness from mental to physical. This is one in a mixed community in Tel Aviv. And so at this point, we had a problem. Hans Christian worked in a Fab Lab a few hours above the Arctic Circle, so far north that satellite dishes look down at the ground. And I showed him a few tips, and next time I saw him in the lab, he was designing robot vehicles. And this is Chapiso. She works in what was an apartheid-era township in South Africa, Soshanguve. And I didn't realize she was doing the work of MIT classes from the Fab Lab in the township. And so they were falling off a cliff. So we started a program called the Fab Academy, where rather than ripping them out or having them look at a computer screen, students have peers in the labs with mentors and work groups locally, and then we connect them globally with video and content sharing. So that picture is Guillaume eating lettuce. He wanted food. He was in a Fab Lab outside Barcelona. On the first day in Fab Academy, all he could do is make a picture of an aquaponic system. Then he could make a CAD sketch. And then he proceeded, he's making a little laser cutter model. Then he's learning to do large format machining. And so he's learning to machine the large format. Then he's learning to do the instrumentation and doing 3D design. And right about here, he's learning to design circuit boards and do embedded programming to develop the brains of the aquaponic system. And so right about here, he's up to the Aquaduino to power his system. And then I'll let this run a minute more. This is all homework in the Fab Academy. And then round about week 16, I love this picture. Here he is with the first food produced from it. And it's become a whole program for urban food production, where everything you see here was made by him with the tools in the lab. We ran a lab at the White House. This was Barcelona's mayor starting a 40-year countdown to urban self-sufficiency. So the city produces what it consumes. Here's a bill about to be submitted in the US Congress.
I'm United States Congressman Bill Foster, and I'm one of the few members of the United States House of Representatives who was a scientist before entering politics. So I often tell people that I represent about 1/3 of the strategic reserve of physicists in Congress. But
It's now
when I came
100%.
into work each day in physics, my first stop often wasn't to my office computer or some meeting, but to the laboratory machine shop to check on the progress of some parts that I designed for an experiment or for part of an accelerator. So I believe I can safely say that I'm the only member of the United States Congress that knows how to program numerically controlled machine tools. I'm proud to announce that I recently introduced legislation in the United States House of Representatives which supports the goals and mission of the National Fab Lab Network.
So he goes on to explain that he's chartering as a new kind of national lab of connected local labs as in the national interest. Instead of $1 billion far away, it's universal access to digital fabrication. It's about to get submitted. This was a lab we did with the UN to deliver humanitarian relief by shipping data and producing on demand locally. Those are all vignettes of what's happening today at this moment. And so take away, work used to look like this, But when consumers become creators, this is the future of work. It's not you do a job in a factory to get money to get something. You can actually just make the thing. It's not free, but it gets rid of all of those upstream steps. And that's not a projection. That's today. Now we start looking ahead. So mini computers became the hobbyist computers. When the hobbyist computers became personal, they weren't universal, but they were accessible. And so this is rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping machines. These are machines we made with the machines. So like here's a whole Fab Lab in a briefcase. It's a motion system made in a Fab Lab that has interchangeable mounts that can print, cut, mail, and get to carry on luggage. That spun off a number of computer companies to make the machines, but what we're more interested is not a company to make the machines, but the Fab Labs actually making the Fab Labs themselves. And so we've been building modular systems of hardware and software that let you rapidly make machines. And so this is a rapid prototyping machine made out of a modular construction kit that was itself made in a Fab Lab and is good enough to make a version of itself that's better than the one that made it. So the machines can actually propagate to make the machines. And so that's not a projection. That's here today. We're just transitioning. 1 million is roughly the number of towns on Earth. That was roughly the number of these hobbyist computers. And so to get to 1 million, it's not going to be 1 million 2-ton facilities. It's going to be 1 million Fab Labs made in Fab Labs. Not for everyone yet, but it's here today. But to go beyond that, the billion stage, there's a problem. 1 billion is where computing became nearly universal. Within a prefactor, the number of people on Earth. To me, I count the zeros. They count the prefactor, which I'll tell you about. And so to make the machine that makes the machine, you need electronic components. I buy a lot of them from DigiKey. DigiKey stocks 500,000 capacitors, not an inventory of 500,000. It's 500,000 different SKUs, each with an inventory, just changing the size and shape. 500,000 types of resistors, 500,000 types of capacitors, and that's crazy because it's only 2 or 3 properties, conducting, insulating, resistive. So we started studying what we call digital materials, not digital designs. A 3D printer is analog, but digital materials. And so Lego works just like amino acids, which are the proteins that make you. Because they're digital, you can detect and correct errors in their construction. And you don't need a ruler because the geometry comes from the parts, and you can disassemble and reuse them. So this is Lego, but this is Lego scaling down so small you can't see it. And then this is even smaller, so you need an electron microscope. That's about the size of a hair. And then that's even small. That's getting so small it's approaching the atoms. So that's nano Lego. And then here's a design tool where instead of buying electronics, you place bricks of these functional materials, model the physics, and then export them as a code to an assembler. And the assembler, this is now like a kid playing with Lego. My audience. Is it? Is it back? Okay, so this is like this is like a kid playing with Lego. But it's the machine. And so, okay. And on bigger scales, this is, let's see, but maybe that's too close. You're good?
You're
okay.
good.
So if you make these bigger, these assemblers can climb on the structures they're building. And so this is work we're doing, for example, with Airbus on NASA to make robots to build jumbo jets and spaceships by being part of the structure they're building and climbing on the structure they're building. And so with that, you can do things like make airplanes that can flap their wings and change shape as they fly by coding the construction of the materials. So now we're going to go still further. At the rate of current progress, each of these is 10 to 15 years. So the internet went to 1 trillion. There's now about 1 trillion devices connected to the internet. People, a rough number is, have about 1,000 things around them. When we get to the trillion stage, and by trillion, I mean 1 trillion Fab Labs. I don't mean 1 trillion 2 tons. I mean 1 trillion equivalents to the capabilities of the Fab Lab. In the same way, if you built me from those parts I showed you, it would take 3 million years on the machine I just showed you. And that's a long time to wait for output. So if you do it the way biology does, it's 1 second. And so the difference is in biology, the assembler, which is called the ribosome, makes itself. The assembler assembles itself. So here's our design for an assembler that assembles assemblers out of the parts that it's assembling. So you have exponential increase in self-reproducing assemblers. And so here's all the parts to make a self-reproducing assembler. So for example, if it flexes, that's a mechanism. With an actuation, it's motion. And then that becomes a motion system. And then you add logic parts. And those are all the parts to make a self-reproducing assembler. And now here's the design tool for the self-reproducing machine. This is placing now about 20 material properties, semiconductors now, a few other properties. And so it's designing a machine that communicates a computation for its construction. And so this is how we're designing the self-reproducing assembler. And what's interesting is they were the fathers. This is engendered. The fathers of computing, birth at its origin, Alan Turing and John von Neumann. The last things they did was study exactly this. Turing studied how genes give rise to form. And von Neumann studied self-reproducing machines. He wanted to understand life, and he did it by studying how a machine, is he okay? Good. How a machine communicates a computation to construct itself. And so at that point, you can't separate communication, computation, and fabrication. They're all merged in this digitization of reality. That was a theoretical construct. We're here today because we can actually do it. So now, this is bonus material for the movie The Martian, where 20th Century Fox wanted to know how you really bootstrap a civilization on Mars. And what's emerging is you don't reproduce the Industrial Revolution on Mars. You essentially create life in non-living materials in the way I've described here. So here's where we are. The internet went from 1 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 to 1,000,000,000 to 1,000,000,000,000. Literally, the Nest has the computing capability of the mini computer that I started on. The cost went from 100,000 to 1,000,000 to 100,000 to 10,000 to 1,000 to 100 to 10. And that was about 50 years of scaling. In the same way, going from the single mainframe of fabrication, the 1952 NC Mill, the Fab Labs are just like the mini computers. And I just showed you all the steps to get to the trillion stage. What's interesting is they're all in the lab today. But this is here today, and this is decades to come for it to come out. But they're all here. You can already see it coming. Now, what you should take away from all of this is a single thing. This point is when Micro-Soft got started. And this is when the Homebrew Computer Club got started. And the thing called the Internet got started. And this idea of video games. All of those things happened at exactly this point, and this is exactly where we are today. So we're in the process of inventing what is the internet, what is Micro-Soft for this new world, and preparing for this 50-year of scaling. So with that, this is where I stop. My talk's over, everybody claps, and I ask a few questions. And I go home. But if you listen, Joel and Alan are groaning. No, but you.
So as Neil says, this is the point at which we say, at that point on his curve, there were winners and losers. People who got what was happening became household names of the next century. People who didn't got left, so to speak, in the dust of history. At this point, for us to tell the rest of the story, I'd like to unpack it in just a couple of quick ways. The first is to go back to the beginning. This is a recent picture of the three of us. Needless to say, it's not just the photo credit, but the actual credit goes to our parents. And in a sense, that's the origin of the book. Our parents were both labor arbitrators. They were professors of industrial relations. They encouraged us to each follow our passions, and as you'll hear, they're all very different. They did instill in all of us a sense of social justice. But it was really in my mom's later years, after our dad had passed, that advancing Alzheimer's was making it harder for her to communicate, but she enjoyed hearing us talk. And about 1.5 years ago, when we were visiting with her, that conversation became a, yes, Neil, we actually believe that you're right about the technology. We just don't trust you to get it right about society. And so
What could go wrong?
We often needed that scream bot every now and then.
And so, you know, in a very real sense, Neil represents science. My work is in social science. Alan's work is in the humanities. And the conversation behind the book is really a journey into looking at digital fabrication through all three lenses. Now, Neil gave you sort of the 20-minute intro to who he is. I'll give you the 2-minute intro to the lens that I'm bringing to the conversation. I sort of went into the family business. I studied industrial relations like my parents, and this is a picture of the 2007 Ford UAW national negotiations, which I helped them to redesign after having spent over 2 decades in designing and helping to implement their safety and operating systems. So I sort of lived in the world of labor management partnership in service or manufacturing, and transitioned into working with a lot of multi-stakeholder consortia, not just two-party partnerships. And it was quite separate from digital fabrication, with 2 exceptions. In the very first Fab Lab in the south end of Boston, for about 3 years in the early 2000s, my son and I, almost every weekend, would volunteer in the lab as kind of a community activity. So I began to get a sense for what Fab Labs could do, the amazing community connections that are possible. So when I became a dean of the School of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois, we took the oldest building, second oldest building on campus, it was a horse stable, and put in it some of the most modern technology of the world to make a Fab Lab. And the important thing about that, and it's really the subtext for this whole event and the story we're telling, is it only took maybe 3 or 4 weeks to install the equipment, a couple more weeks to do some rewiring and put in some exhaust vents and what have you. It took about 3 years to get the committees, the connections to the Boys and Girls Club, to get the campus to say, yes, people can come onto campus and have unlimited access to an open space, and all of the social and institutional changes that were needed to produce a Fab Lab. So the rate at which the technology advanced was, if you will, exponential. The rate at which the people in the social systems advanced was linear. So that's the piece that I represent as the social sciences.
So I'm the youngest, Neil's the middle, Joel's the oldest, just to orient you. Before I was born, Neil took all the science and technology genes. He mentioned we think about prefactor. I have no idea what prefactor means, actually. But I do think about how...
It's the number in front.
You can write it.
That helps a lot.
But I do think a lot about the power of the technology and that everybody should be able to enjoy it. And I don't think that is necessarily going to be the case. My background briefly is, because I didn't have the science and technology genes, I went to Hollywood to make movies, ended up working in China and Hollywood in the 80s and saw the power of media and technology on society. Helped rebuild Activision, a commercial video game company, through the 90s, ended up running their studios. Our games were played by millions of people, tens if not hundreds of millions of hours of deeply engaged technology-mediated engagement. After that, I got very interested in the social impact of business. When I was seeing the impact of our technology and media, co-founded a company called Netamat. The other 2 co-founders are here, that grew out of an art project that was a double bottom line business funded by the Rockefeller Foundation as well as VCs, make money and make impact. Joined the board, became chairman of the board of a nonprofit called Games for Change here in New York to rise the sector of games for impact. I think the founder might be here. And then, when I was seeing the power of the medium, I started a double bottom line company called Eline to bring the rigor of an Activision, to bring impact games and digital media learning services to millions or tens of millions of kids and young adults. Like Joel, although it's not my core focus, I kept intersecting, actually running into Neil at conferences that we didn't realize we would both be at. And 2 interesting stories. One, Neil mentioned the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. They actually approached us a couple years ago to do a mission-aligned business to make a video game that shared and celebrated their culture with a global audience as a for-profit initiative to help make them sustainable as a nonprofit. It's a long story, but we ended up going on a 2.5-year journey. We built a game team, 36 Alaska Native elders, writers, and storytellers went on a journey for 2 years. The game came out. It was profitable. It's won a lot of awards. We've had about 3 million players. They've taken their revenue, invested in us. They're our largest shareholder. Our chairman's head of the tribal council. When he saw that we were working on a DARPA project on the future of fabrication, They got very excited. They opened the Fab Lab. It's a thriving Fab Lab. It was honored at the White House. They're now building a network of Fab Labs on the Arctic slope, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So these cross-discipline intersections are really quite remarkable. So that's my background. So we start the book with a thought experiment. And Neil mentioned Moore's Law. Everybody should Google and go back and read that article from 1965. It's remarkable. And he's not Nostradamus, Gordon Moore. He's simply observing 10 years and looking ahead 10 years. And he predicted things like personal computers, mobile phones, smart cars. And imagine, Neil mentioned all the businesses that came out of it. But imagine if you were a social scientist or a policymaker or a social entrepreneur, and you were sitting there thinking of the power of this technology, you might start to think about things like, well, what divides might this create? Will there be a concept of digital divides? Joel and I researched it, and we couldn't find any social scientists or policymakers really until the mid-'80s that were even thinking about the doubling of the technology and the impact of societies. The social sciences were incredibly reactive. The entrepreneurs were quicker, the science fiction writers were quicker, but the folks that build the institutions were much slower. We have a second chance right now with Fab. Okay? So Neil talked about access. When we think about Fab inclusion, like digital inclusion, we break it into 4 things: access, literacy, an enabling ecosystem, and risk mitigation. Right now, we're 50 years into the first 2 digital revolutions. 4 billion people do not have access to the internet. 2 billion are underserved. Try writing a document or doing CAD/CAM design on a feature phone or a low-end smartphone. That's very limited access. People can't afford full-time access. So that means about 6 billion people don't even have the foundation for the powerful capabilities that Neil was showing.
And by the way, the technology could reach 8 billion people. It's social decisions and choices that result in that digital divide, not necessarily the limits of the technology.
Almost 50 years after that article, Obama made a speech, and there's similar speeches like this in countries around the world, saying that digital connectivity in the internet is a necessity, like water and electricity. And Fab will become that too, but we can't wait 50 years to realize that. Literacy is interesting. Neil mentioned often when we talk about this, afterwards people think it's just 3D printers because 3D printers is getting so much hype. But as Neil mentioned, that's about 20 to 30% of what's in a Fab Lab now and doesn't even really contemplate the future of digital or programmable materials. The analogy is kind of like a microwave in the kitchen. It's useful. It's definitely useful, can do a lot of things, and they're getting better, but it is not the only thing. But literacy goes much, much deeper. Fab literacy is almost like a meta-literacy. So you have to understand computer-aided design and all the different software and interfaces that's involved in designing. Computer-aided manufacturing, how that software talks to additive machines, subtractive machines, doing embedded computing. But it even goes deeper. Because of the consumables, often one of the largest expenses in Fab Labs are the actual materials you're using in the machines. You have to understand the chemical or biological properties. There are multiple literacies that sit on top of literacies to be able to accomplish the type of things that Neil was describing in terms of making what you can consume. And these are just some pictures. That's literally fires from Neil's lab where people didn't tend to the laser cutter. That's when 3D printers go, hey, wow, this is hard. This is hard stuff. So it's not just access. You need the literacies once you have the access to meet personal and professional goals.
And this, by the way, is the curriculum for Neil's How to Make Anything class. But their joke is, of course,
So you got the mic.
this is the curriculum for Neil's How to Make Anything class. And the joke, of course, it's often, unfortunately, how to almost make anything.
So I'll start this, and then I'll hand it off to Joel. Probably one of the most important things about an enabling ecosystem. So access and literacy are critical, but you also need an ecosystem. And one of the key elements of an ecosystem is mentors. Because this stuff is hard, you need mentors. You either need local mentors or mentors online that can help you on your journey to meet whatever your goals are using these powerful technologies. There are very few mentors in the ecosystems. This guy Jens is wonderful. This picture is him giving President Obama's grandmother in Kenya slippers with the Obama image on it with a design downloaded from Japan, fabricated locally using local materials. Jens decided he was so fascinated by Fab Labs that he basically took more than a year off to travel and visit Fab Labs around the world. And at the beginning, he was just learning, he was absorbing. By the end, he became an Uber mentor because he saw all of these insights from Fab Labs around the world, and he's become one of the most sought after mentors. But he's got projects he wants to do, he's doing amazing stuff, he's actually pioneering a lot of the roadmap that Neil outlined. So we need mechanisms for people to be like Jens and to become mentors. And the book talks a lot about some ideas on how to do that.
So part of the yes, but conversation with aligning social systems to match this accelerating roadmap that Neil described involves, as Alan says, the access, the literacy, and the ecosystems, and part of ecosystems is the people. But part of it is also the platforms, digital platforms on which the access to knowledge and enablers rests. And Neil loves to create software that links CAD, CAM, materials, and other pieces of that. And really what he's done is breakthrough along those lines, and still it's clunky. That it's very hard for people to make all of the different pieces work. And what you see here are just 2 of maybe 20 relevant platforms when you think of the platform to share designs, the platform to share products, the platform to find mentors, the platform to do equipment maintenance. And when we think of the ecosystem supporting digital fabrication and supporting that roadmap, it's the people, it's the platforms, it's also the processes. Processes are communication, negotiation, trust building, all the different interactive things that take place. Early on, and actually this was a conversation we had, I'd been doing a lot of chartering of new institutional arrangements in industry and suggested to Neil that he ought to have a charter for Fab Labs. And indeed, he wrote what is a very good initial charter about what are the kind of rules of the road, a 1-page document to bring the Fab community together. This summer, Alan, Neil, and I were at Neil's big annual Fab 13 event. This is the 13th year that 1,000 people come together and build up a mini Fab Lab that's a shared community space and other things. We did a workshop on this global stakeholder map that we did on the ecosystem. And one of the things we asked people about is the charter. And instantly, the room kind of erupted. One person stood up, a fellow from Africa who works with humanitarian Fab Labs, and said there are crucial decisions in the Fab ecosystem that the charter doesn't really tell us how we should be making those decisions. It needs to be adapted. The next person got up from the Benelux ecosystem, and he said, on the contrary, we have a half dozen or dozen Fab Labs, and we use the charter daily or weekly to teach new people about how to live in the system. The third fellow, who was from the Ireland Fab Lab that Neil mentioned at the intersection of the Protestant and Catholic communities, he said, no, the charter is just the tip of a whole governance story that's needed in the ecosystem. It's not just about a charter, it's about governance of an emerging ecosystem.
A good example of the charter is it talks about open access, which is a great aspirational goal, which we all support. A challenge for many universities is they can't always offer open access to people in their community. Libraries, and there's a great analogy between libraries and Fab Labs, are great about open access, but they often don't have the technology to run a Fab Lab. So there's a lot of tensions in the system about how to accomplish the goals of Fab inclusion with the constraints. So it's a living charter.
So in terms of how does this roadmap really happen, it's people, it's processes that add up together with these platforms to be the enabling ecosystem, but there's more. About jobs, about employment, you can go back 50 years and find people worrying about technology taking people's jobs, but the truth is that there are some serious tensions in the system. There are 38,000 radiologists in the United States, and that's a job that will go away with artificial intelligence. On the other hand, there's 1.2 million elementary school teachers. They will have their work enhanced by technology, but it won't go away nearly so quickly. When we look at the Fab ecosystem through the lens of employment, the first thing that you see is that, in fact, it is not a workplace. So all the things that we've set up in society to ensure fair treatment, to protect against discrimination, to ensure safety, to resolve disputes, all the stuff that is my sort of world, depends on a regulatory structure that assumes a workplace. And so one of the questions with this distributed ecosystem is how to address the social system issues that we've long worried about in society on a context in which it's not a workplace. And if we go further, we met with the fellow who is part of the strategy group at Intel. Neil worked closely with Intel in doing the data for Moore's Law. And we said, help us to understand the social context at Intel of spending 30 years staying pace with Moore's Law. And he said, the only way to understand it is, of course, the scene in Indiana Jones' movie where the boulder's coming down. He said, for 30 years, we've been racing to stay ahead of the boulder. And what's in that comment is the notion that Moore's Law is not a law of nature. It's a socially constructed construct which a company adopted as a strategy, which an industry adopted as a marker, and which society came to expect as things becoming faster and cheaper. But that's all a social construction. And the question here is Fab Labs don't have, and probably are not likely to have, a single Intel or even an industry structure that's keeping pace for the accelerating change. It's a distributed ecosystem. And so one of the questions that we ask is, how do you have R&D that stays ahead of the boulder to match the exponential change that Neil talks about, when we don't have a single hierarchy to drive it? So that's risk, that's literacy, that's access, that's enabling ecosystem. There's one more key piece to the puzzle.
So one of the first questions that come up is bad people doing bad things in Fab Labs. And this is a very real issue. There is no, pardon the expression, silver bullet. We have a lot of metaphors like that in our language. But that is a gun that's made in a Fab Lab. Neil will often say, oh, Fab Labs are not an efficient way to make a gun. There's more efficient ways to get that on the street. I think that's a cop-out. I need the scream thing when he says that, because his premise is this is going to get better, better, faster, cheaper, cheaper. So this is a real risk. And there's no simple solution, but Joel and I really did, when we interviewed about 40 of the Fab pioneers, we asked a lot about bad people doing bad things. And we got a lot of different answers. Again, can't go through them all tonight, but one of them is Yogesh in India, who started one of the very first Fab Labs. It was running. It serves underserved youth in India, and often kids will come in and they'll try to sheath a knife or something like that. And he sets a culture very early on when they're young about what's appropriate and what's not. And that culture really does propagate. And I've been part of building game communities that reach millions and millions of people. And I can tell you, when you build a culture early on with feedback loops, with mentors providing feedback loops when people do things that are inappropriate, the culture propagates. It really does. If you don't, it doesn't propagate. So now is the time to start to think about the cultures around bad people doing bad things. There's also technology. If you build into the system identifying chemicals that might make bombs, even if it's machines that make machines, you can still build those feedback loops on. We talk in the book a number of approaches to dealing with this risk, but it's real.
And there's other risks in this system. BioFab is becoming its own accelerating story. And it is true, you can print a human liver, you can print a variety of things in a lab. And those of you that know about medical ethics review panels and the other social systems that we've established to help provide guidance with these technologies, they are linear at best against this accelerating technology. So we need a much more robust, forgive the expression, of Ford-built tough ecosystem of social systems to govern BioFab. And another risk that's sort of hidden under the surface, but that is there, which is, as Neil and Alan mentioned, the consumable materials are a big part of how this enterprise works. When we get 30 years out to programmable and digital materials, we do solve a lot of that problem, but if Fab Labs and equivalent spaces are doubling every year and a half, and we're at 1,000, once we get to 5,000, 10,000, 15, 20,000, there's going to be a consumables bottleneck. And so there's an environmental story here that we worry about with risk as well.
So another final kind of interesting risk is a lot of Neil's mental map for the future was the Star Trek Replicator. In many ways, his career has been building the Replicator. When we interviewed a lot of people in the Fab ecosystem, there were a number of people who really were horrified by that mental map. Their feeling is, first of all, it's probably one company that makes the Replicator. If Captain Picard's tea, which in this episode it did not come out hot, the way he liked it, he probably wouldn't know how to fix it. He probably wouldn't have the literacies. So are we creating a society where one or two companies will actually be further down the roadmap and control these, or are we cultivating the skills, dispositions, and literacies to be able to control it? The mental maps of the future, if we can see it, we can build it. And that's not just the cool tech, it's the organizations and institutions as well.
So with that, we have a couple of parting thoughts that we'd like to share with you. The first is, as we think...
We're really short on time. I'm sorry.
Okay,
Yeah,
as
we
we got it.
I'll give you the 10-second version. When Neil talks about the properties of digital science, modularity, reversibility, reliability, locality, what he's really talking about is the technology. We believe that it's possible to think about the organizations and the institutions in modular terms. It's hard sometimes when you form something for it to be reversible, but principles of error correction and other principles can be built into social systems. And in fact, if we're going to have the kind of social systems that co-evolve at an accelerating pace with the technology, the design challenge that we take on is thinking of social systems that correspond to the properties of the technology.
Ultimately, we have to appeal to the head. Intellectual reason, the stuff that Neil shows, this is really amazing stuff once you really understand the science. We have to appeal to the heart. The incredible experience of making something yourself is almost unimaginable for a lot of these young adults. And ultimately the hands. People have to experience it themselves, politicians, policymakers, to realize the power. And it's this integrated head, heart, and hands that'll help us make sure the third digital revolution doesn't help just the fortunate few.
So when we did our global stakeholder map, we did have an open-ended question, and we asked them, what's a word or phrase that reflects what digital fabrication means to you? By the way, the Global South always worries about being at the bottom of the map, so we flipped the map since the technology is disrupting everything else. But to conclude, we have some quotes here. We won't read them. We'll actually turn it to the Q&A that come from all over the world as people responded to what does digital fabrication mean. And in a sense, the words kind of create the poetic vision that's underneath the story that we've been telling. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, I'll tell you what, here's what I'd like to do. Let's just, if you guys shift over there a little bit, let's just put in there. Because one of the things I want to do is tap into a lot of the folks here in the audience. We've got a great group here. But I did want to give Neil, since we kind of had Neil through out his big picture piece, and then we saw the second half of the conversation pushing back a little bit. I mean, if we could get through these various bottlenecks and these system changes and all the issues that were brought up there, what's the kind of big picture vision of how, I mean, could this literally create a kind of an abundant society? I mean, is this something that like totally changes the game in ways that are so desirable that in fact, why wouldn't we go there? Or that's a motivator. Because right now, I don't think we really saw the potential there beyond. You started to move to that, but you didn't really fill out the vision of what this could be if we get through these problems.
So, yep. I believe in history, no one technology has either saved or destroyed us, and so it's likely that applies here. But to give a...
Actually, let's sit back here, because these folks here, talk to the audience, actually, rather than me. Yeah, that's good.
You're pretty interesting. Let me give you a vignette of your question. I want to talk a little bit about the Barcelona experience. Barcelona, fabulous design sense, over 50% youth unemployment. Whole generation can't leave home and work as we understand it. Amazing number. The economy is broken. My colleague who started the Fab Lab became the city architect. His buddy, that's Vicente Trias, became the mayor. And what they started doing was putting Fab Labs in districts in the city as part of urban infrastructure. So if you live in the city, you can produce what you consume. And a really focal example was, there's a neighborhood called Ciutat Meridiana, which is at the very edge of Barcelona. It's a very poor immigrant community where immigrants who didn't fit anywhere else would get pushed at the edge of town. And they were going to get one of these labs. And instead, they occupied the building and said, no, we want a food bank because we don't have food. And I was at this amazing session with them where the city's response was, OK, you can have a food bank, but let us show you how this Fab Lab is being used to build technology for urban agriculture to grow food. And you can make furniture, and you can make toys, and you can start businesses. And there's this amazing pivot, and that's been so successful through multiple administrations that are now making a whole district of the city as a maker district. And so they started this 40-year countdown to the city producing what it consumes. So instead of trash going in and products going out, the data comes and goes globally, but the atoms stay locally, being able to construct. And so it's a microcosm of Brexit, elections, all of that has been about import, jobs, work. It all assumes that work is something you do, doing something you don't want to do to get money that's a resource to then get something that you want. If you can produce it directly, it's not free, but you get rid of all of the upstream steps, and you could make it for yourself. A friend could make it for you. You could make it as a little business. You could do it as a mass business. And so it's fundamentally challenging what is work, what is money. Now, to understand how it plays out, music was the labels. File sharing came and nobody pays anybody. What's settled is the labels are still there, but that's arguably the least interesting music. There's all these tiers of music making and businesses around music that didn't exist before. This is going to do that, but for the physical world.
But I will say, what's embedded in your question is an assumption about markets in society. You know, if you go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, John Stuart Mill said, on the one hand, we don't want to have poverty and people who are disadvantaged in society, so he had an aspirational vision. But then he said that the invisible hand of the marketplace would take care of it. And in fact, the origins of most of the social sciences, unfortunately, 30, 40, sometimes 70 or 100 years after that beginning, was no, markets can't do it by itself. There are issues of environmental impacts, child labor, and all sorts of other things that we have to worry about. That's where the social sciences came from, but they were reactive. What Neil's describing is not a market model. Markets are still a part of the story, but it's a collaborative model that sits side by side a market economy. And the challenge of making that work, you know, is no longer one for social science to be reactive to what's happening, but actually to be proactive in how do we think about the rules of the game for a very different kind of world.
I mean, I'll make a simple observation. I've spent a lot of time at Neil's house. He has access to one of the world's best Fab Labs. There's very little in that house that he made in a Fab Lab. And I say that
Other than the Fab Lab itself.
yeah, I mean, he literally has a Fab Lab in his office, but when you look around, so I mean, I think there's a reality check here. It is coming, it is powerful. And one thing I would say, again, that came out of all of our interviews and our surveys is right now the process in the Fab Lab, making things is amazing. You really do develop skills that are cross disciplines. You develop dispositions like critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, collaboration. These are things you're gonna need to survive and thrive in any job, whether it's mediated by technology whenever it comes. And it is exhilarating. And every kid should have access. It should be like the Carnegie Libraries. Every school should have one. Every community should have one. But it's a big leap to say people are going to make what they consume. That's, as Joel said, there's a lot of issues, which again, we try to address in the book before that comes around. But don't mistake the fact that right now, everybody should have a Fab Lab because it will help your youth, it'll help young adults, it'll help in job
And
retraining.
Let me make that really concrete. Google, big local presence, took many years to figure out that it doesn't sell search. It gives away search, but it sells the benefit of search. And that thought is really the heart of the economic lesson from the last digital revolution. It's a mistake. You can make almost anything, and that's what excites me, but it's a mistake to over-focus on that. If you take Blair's lab in Detroit that I showed, one of the primary products of his lab and one of the primary financial models is at-risk youth. He takes kids in juvenile justice, teenage pregnancy, he brings them to the lab, he delivers better life outcomes that he measures compared to the social services on offer, and one of the main products of the lab is the transformation of the life of the children. So it's a mistake to over-focus on the widget, much as I do.
Got you. But I mean, just one last thing before we go into the audience here. I mean, climate change, big pressing challenge. I mean, is this, could we kind of re-engineer the whole global supply chain and dramatically drop kind of, you know, transportation costs and kind of localize manufacturing in ways that, you know, that could really make huge, you know, shifts?
Yes, but not quite in that way. So, you know, if you go to a store and buy a toaster down the road, a truck brought it to the store, and then a train brought it to the truck, and then a ship brought it to a harbor, and this whole global supply chain. This could get rid of all of that with all of the regulatory, all of that. But if you look at the energy budget of all of that, it's not that big. But what this can do that's really exciting, and we've been collaborating with Anne-Marie Lovins on this part, is local microenergy. Instead of mass manufacturing of energy far away, you can distribute local energy production. And there's a lot of really interesting work on using digital fabrication to produce little microscale energy conversion devices locally, not at the end of long supply chains. And that makes a big difference. And also, and then one other part related to that is probably the single biggest energy resource is wasted energy. And another major fab project is local versions of smart Internet of Things distributed systems. Again, not producing that globally, but locally producing intelligent infrastructure is a very busy Fab Lab kind of project.
And one other thing, which we talked about a little earlier, is the consumables. And one of the 40 people that Alan mentioned that we talked to that really captured our imagination is a woman, she's a Rhodes Scholar who's now in Santiago, Chile at the University of Santiago, who's building a
What's
web...
her name?
It's Alicia...
I can't pronounce what's name. Garum or what's... Sorry, Alicia.
That's close. But she's building a web platform to document the properties of consumable materials that are locally available. If you live near a desert, what's the property of sand? If you live near a jungle, what's the property of the sap in the tree, and so on, with the idea of a local circular economy around the consumable materials, which means that people in labs in different regions will produce products that correspond to the available consumable materials in that region, and will let the atoms stay local. What's interesting is that her background is both in material science and social science, and she's trying to figure out how to go into an ecosystem where normally the properties of material science are viewed as competitive secrets that are closely guarded by most companies. And in a sense, it's quite disruptive, the idea that we can openly share that data, but it does address what would be a key environmental rate limiter.
And I'll just put one thought. We live in a society right now with a lot of pitched battles, a lot of sort of tribalism, and there is sort of a globalist tribalism and a local, tribalism that is a false dichotomy, because you can be globally connected for knowledge, but increasingly locally self-sufficient. And even having that mental map starts a dialogue, a bridge between these different communities that aren't communicating well together right now.
To illustrate that, Bill Foster's bill that he's submitting in the House, the co-sponsors include the most liberal Democratic representatives and the most extreme conservative right-wing Freedom Caucus, because they exactly meet at this issue. Local sustainability without global supply chains exactly nails middle of Democratic agenda and middle of Republican agenda, and it just crosses them. It's not coastal, it's not rural, urban. It's a rare issue where actually everybody seems to agree.
Making things is deeply, deeply human. And so it really does, because it is deeply human, it really can be a bridge across these divides.
All right, let's open it up to folks who, many of you probably have something to do with this world here. In fact, let's start here. But here's the deal. Stand up, say who you are, and then ask, but do stand up when you're doing it, because we're going to be videoing this. And,
Hi, I'm Fred Gutturl, formerly with Scientific American until recently. This is really interesting. The idea that this technology is going to kind of change the social, it sounds like change the social structure of the world a little bit, sounds a little bit to me like the information wants to be free stage of the internet, and that that sort of lasted for a while until then we got Facebook and Google, which are highly centralized. And it makes me think that the world that we live in is a world where there's increased income inequality, more centralization. So you're sounding a little naive to me. And how would you interpret this this technology in terms of fitting into the world as it actually exists?
So we think that
just not everyone has to answer, so just take one.
Okay.
One person.
The social science on birth order is mostly indeterminate, but we think middle children tend to be techno-optimists. And Neil will tell you that this is flying under the radar. There's no single control point for this technology, so it's not going to be captive to some of the dynamics of the first two digital revolutions. What Alan and I would say is maybe. But it's also true that there's some enormous economic interests that are at play that will have incentives to figure out where there are control points, where there is money to be made. And it's at this kind of early stage, at the knee of the curve, where we should be talking about the assumptions that are embedded in the technology. We didn't talk about access and literacy early on in the first two digital revolutions, and in some important ways, we're paying the price. I'm not saying it's easy. I think you're exactly right. It's a horse race in which the commercial market-driven interests, which, by the way, still have important parts to play, but may not be the dominant driver if this image comes about, but it's also not guaranteed.
But just as a quick vignette of what's a little bit different this time, I've helped groups in a number of parts of the world use the technology in Fab Labs to make their own regional internets, where instead of it being a telco provider and you negotiate over the terms, you make antennas and radios and build networks out of them. And that is different this time around.
Woman here in the, stand up and identify yourself.
Okay, hi, my name's Diane, and thank you for a very interesting evening, and I'm sure a wonderful book. So you've spoken a lot about the how and the what, but less, and perhaps maybe I just didn't hear it, not much about the why. Because I'm wondering, there seems a kind of implicit logic accepted that more is more. And is more always more? I mean, there's a kind of way in which there is a gadgety, there's the possibility of things becoming very gadgety, and I understand that there's the kind of, you have a structure associated with this where advisors, mentors can help with the why, but it seems that I mean, given that this is kind of a maker ground up thing, it seems funny that there's a kind of outsourcing of the why to a sort of system outside of it, or maybe I just haven't heard, or maybe you haven't talked about it. I'd just like to understand more, because we see that, tax plans who are about giving more to more, and enough already.
So yeah, a really important clarification is, in this Fab Lab project, my plan was to set up one, and that was just to shut the NSF up because they wanted me to measure social impact so I could go back to work. And so we did one with Milking in Boston, but then there was a strong Ghanaian connection and a South African, they started this doubling. Key to your question, first of all, is that graph I showed you, different from maybe the Intel era, is nobody's pushing, nobody's telling anybody to do this, nobody's trying to force them out. This is all pull. This doubling is people opting in. And so the first distinction is that it's pull, nobody's pushing. The second part to that is, as this started expanding over rural India and African shanty towns, I had my version of it. Is this the right thing? Should this even be happening now? One message I got back very strongly was, that's not a question for me to answer. That's a question for the world to answer. But one of the really interesting things we've seen is, I naively thought like poor places would do poor things and rich places would do rich things, and it's completely wrong. What's amazing is anywhere these labs are, people use them for art, they use them for play, they use them for education, they use them for businesses, they use them for infrastructure. Any part of the world, they use them the same way. They're magnets for innovation. And so one of these started on the Giza Plateau, and during the Morsi riots, a colleague, Dina, who's called them and said, "Are you okay?" And they laughed, and they said the bright inventive kids who had no interest in sectarian conflict took the Morsi riots as a day off to work in the lab. And for me, that's sort of the future of the world in a way in that story. So what we're presenting, there is no Intel pushing. This is, we're trying to keep up to the pull.
Well, I've worked on a lot of games where kids spend incredible amounts of time in front of the computer. I speak in front of parents. Their biggest concern is actually the amount of time kids are spending in front of their technology, and I feel that as a parent as well. One of the wonderful things about Fab Labs is it takes you off the technology into the real world. It really does take you into the world of atoms, and I do think it's incredibly healthy to not just spend your time in front of a screen, but actually physically making things. And just that emotional center is part of why you see so much joy in these Fab Labs.
Okay, would you stand up, just identify yourself and maybe how you come to this.
Good evening. I'm Joseph Birch with Communities Doing Good, a community improvement organization based in Charlotte, North Carolina. First of all, I want to say thank you for the arduous efforts you put forth to continue to advance this technology, and thank you for also providing that technology to two of the institutions we have in Charlotte, which is the Charlotte Latin School and also CPCC, a community college.
In fact, they did Fab Academy. They were a great group, Charlotte Latin.
Yes, they are. Thank you. I have a number of questions to ask you. However, I would like to follow up with and email you some of them, and I'd just like to address one of them. You mentioned multiple literacies. For the most part, are the literacies already, well, for the most part, the literacies are already in real-time application. And as referenced, the tech has progressed exponentially. Meanwhile, what has become of or shall I say, what has become or what is the emerging process to advance the technology at the social, cultural, socioeconomic, and social academic level?
Whoa.
So, it's
That's an older brother question.
Let me illustrate the question with, in a sense, the story of remake learning in Pittsburgh, because I think it gets exactly to your point. You asked about what happens to the sort of whole social economic system, and how do you teach people about this that cuts across social economic divides of various kinds. 10 years ago, a group of educators in Pittsburgh got together at a pancake breakfast and said, kids aren't learning the way they used to, and it moved towards more project-based learning. That became a second pancake breakfast, it became a third. Ultimately, there were 17 with ever more people, which led to something called remake learning. There's now 2,000 educators in the Pittsburgh area, K through 12, high school, middle school, community college, Carnegie Mellon, University of Pittsburgh.
And businesses across the whole ecosystem.
And there's about 100 Fab Labs, maker spaces, and other things where the project-based learning is happening. And so part of it is that it's in different neighborhoods where you're on the ground with people in that neighborhood, but it's part of a larger ecosystem around learning happening in a different way. And so part of it is, you said, how does the learning happen? Well, it is project-based learning rather than the sort of traditional model, but it's set in a system where there are these connections and there is access, there is literacy, and there is an ecosystem that is really helping Pittsburgh transition from what was once a steel town into now a center for robotics and innovation that's quite remarkable. And so I think you need to, I guess to put it simply, system problems, and you described system problems, need system solutions.
I mean, I would really underscore, so writing this book was a pain. Joel captured it as book is a 4-letter word. But I think what I learned from it is the social sciences emerged in response to the Industrial Revolution, and they've been reactive ever since. We can now see this roadmap. Your question is really the whole point of tonight. Given that this is 50 years coming, how do we not wait 50 years to react? But you have to sort of build the technology for it, and it doesn't exist. That's the challenge. That's really what tonight's about. Yeah.
Here we go.
Hi. I'm not going to stand up because I'll block everyone. My name's Ruben Steiger, and I've been working in virtual reality, sort of at the intersection of the virtual and real for almost 20 years. I also started a company that used Fab Labs to teach kids entrepreneurship, starting at 8 years old, and with many of the same goals as you're talking about. And my big question for you is, if you had to give advice to the parents of, let's say, an 8-year-old about how to equip them best for the world that they're going to inherit a decade in the future, what would it be? Would it be technical? Would it be playful? What would you say?
So let's see. A little vignette. One of my mentors was Marvin Minsky, who's credited as the father of artificial intelligence. And he's quite a character. Like, it was really dangerous. Whoever would speak to Marvin Minsky before he gave a lecture to could be a stadium of people, because whoever talked to him last is what the talk would be about. And one time I was talking to Marvin, and he said he was about 13 when he figured out what you had to do to grow up, and he decided not to.
My question is, I see that you guys have a lot of projects running for the kids and for social sciences and all the other projects and the aspects. But my question is, have you guys been looking to out of the graduating? Could be in software engineering or QA or artificial intelligence. And my second question is, since you're helping a lot of kids and youngsters with the games and other products to prepare themselves for the future with physical engineering, approaching kids in the United States to help them learn how to code better and to motivate them to be more technologically advanced, because as far as my knowledge, I know that kids in the United States are not familiar with coding at all. A survey that was done in June of this year, it shows that 1 out of every instance don't know about HTML or CSS. Have you thought of making it?
All right, quick one. You know, before Andrew Carnegie, people did not assume that every town and every school should have a library. Afterwards, it became an assumption. It's similar with Fab Labs, because part of Fab Labs is learning to code. And we are developing game platforms to teach people to code, but it has to be in a context where it's well scaffolded, well supported, where there's pathways. So it is very much part of our vision, and we're trying to build the foundation and building blocks to get there.
But also just a clarification, the Fab Academy program that spawned the Bio Academy, that spawned Fab Academy, is aimed at the age you're describing and is teaching those skills, but crucially it doesn't segregate computer science. It integrates coding with all of these other skills. So a lot of my day job is at the level you're describing.
Okay, we're going to take here and then you go to YouTube.
Michael Smolens of DotSub, we're a technology platform to enable video created in any language to be available to. We're doing a lot of work in India and China. So you talked, it was fascinating your chart that where we are is right when Microsoft was starting, and right now is the time when this explosion, wonderful explosion. What have we learned since that time in the last 30 to 35 years, where the negative things, like all of the negative things about Twitter and Facebook and social media, all of that's wonderful. So what can we anticipate that is going to perhaps be potentially negative? Because I think the inequality and the divide is going to continue to get worse because smarter people are going to figure it out and take advantage of it. And what can we do now to help prohibit or mitigate that from happening?
So that's an older brother question. And then Peter, we should also take some from the back of this side, just to spread in the room.
Or people have hands up there?
Yeah,
There's a hand here,
okay.
and there's yeah.
So we'll
But
take
that's
one
an older brother question.
on the way back there.
I mean, the short answer is that's what the whole book, what has motivated us. You just put your finger right on the centerpiece, which is that the digital divides of the first two digital revolution, communication and computation, partly are a reflection of not having the serious discussions 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years ago on access, on inclusion, on what we now know to be an enabling ecosystem, on risk and risk mitigation. And the book is really a call to action for exactly what you're saying. So right on the money.
In the back, and then this woman here.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe strongly in the digital revolution. Yes, I do. I'm looking over there, all those quotes. I'm French speaking. I would like to pick up the first one, but I chose the Colombian one, and I have a good reason for that. The house I have now, when I saw it the first time, I called it the impossible dream. I make it, I have it, I own it. Now, my own dream currently is I'm working on a digital project called African Sky. When I conceive it, you want to use only satellite broadband to build a global village and connect everybody in Africa.
So sorry, just for time, what's the question?
Yep.
We're running out of time.
I'm trying to find out how could I use satellite and undersea cable, because not every country could use one or the other.
Okay, quick answer is the satellites and the undersea cable are billion-dollar investments. Really good work is being done on high-altitude drones that are like low-altitude satellites that you can actually make and run locally. And so aim not at outer space, but sort of the middle of the atmosphere, and you can create regional networks that way, and good work is being done on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Time is short, we have to keep going.
We got just a few more minutes here. This woman here has been wanting to ask her questions. Let's get it to her. And then we can have a few drinks.
Okay, thank you. My name is Fern.
Could you stand up, by the way?
Okay. And thank you for a very interesting talk tonight. My question is, you talked about the double bottom line initiatives of the Fab Labs, and I'm wondering if the roadmap for your ecosystem takes into account for the triple bottom line and the environmental aspect in addition to the financial and the social aspect.
So yeah, I mean, the answer is absolutely yes. And people define a second bottom line or a third bottom line in different ways. It might be learning, health, environment. The key is it's not just return on capital. It's also a return on a benefit for society. And there's various rubrics for measuring that. But I think that's going to be a key part of the ecosystem, that the double bottom line, the mission-based investing ecosystem understands the third digital revolution and begins to embrace it. Because I think that's the type of funding, if there is going to be external funding, that we need to hold the social values to the accelerating technology.
And then I'll note that's also a short-term question, and my role is the optimist. There's no trash in a forest. You get disassembled and the parts get reused. And the later stages in the work I'm describing, where you code not the design but the materials themselves, what's so profound about that is you can unbuild. And so as this roadmap progresses, the whole notion of trash goes away. Trash is analog. Trash means there's no information in the waste. Once you code the construction, you can unbuild as well as you build. And so that's a profound change as you go down this path in the environmental footprint.
Yeah, my name is Max Vasquez, and I'm in fashion tech. And I see a lot of parallels between depth sensor technology, doing body scanning, single ply laser cutting to enable pattern making from CAD, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so my question is, the material that we use in the sewing process, all of which you're wearing, whether it's a knit or a woven, or that material cannot be made by 3D printer. Wait a second, let me, because I know a little bit about 3D printer technology. I know in the future you're going to say, yes, it can, but 3D print is additive. And not only that, it's very expensive at this point, the inputs. So I don't see, in terms of reality we're talking about, I don't see how, from a cost production point of view, it can be done. And the last thing I want to say is that for those people who are not geniuses, and this is one of my things that I wanted to do, is to develop warehouses of common fabrics like denim, 12-ounce denim, and shirting, so that people who lost their jobs in factories can sew at home. What they are missing is really fabrics at a low cost, but everything else can be done because Apple has the...
I'm going to rush for the question. I don't need that.
Yeah,
the answer is the 3D printer can't get anywhere near the clothing, but one of the things you should take away from tonight, fabric, is today there are about 20 technologies for digital fabrication, meaning data in a computer becomes fabricated. Only one of those is the 3D printer, as you understand it. That's the microwave oven of the process. I've helped start companies to do it. I use it about 20% of the time. One of the most interesting areas in digital fabrication is fabric, but it's based on digital fabrication machines that program knitting and weaving. And there's amazing work being done on clothing, tensile structures, all of that by coding at the thread level.
Coding the needle 1x1 3D print. But that is very expensive.
It has nothing to do with 3D printers. It's programmable.
3D
let me
positioning.
Let me talk. It has to do with programmable knitting and weaving. Yes. And there's spectacular work being done on it that creates complex 3D forms from renewable materials by programming it. And one of the most active parts of the machine building is the programmable knitting. So in the short term, programmable knitting and weaving is one of the favorite processes in Fab Labs. It's one of the 20 digital fabrication processes. The 3D printers sit sadly in the corner while we use all the other machines. They're only one of the processes in the short term. In the long term, it's very different. You're made from 20 parts that are discretely assembled. The basic research we're doing decomposes this at a much more fundamental level. That's further out. But in the short term, this talk is not about 3D printers. It's about computers controlling machines that fabricate. And knitting and weaving is one of the most interesting processes.
Actually, the jacquard loom is the very beginning of the whole story.
Yeah, this isn't a 3D printer talk. Maybe the last question?
Huh?
A last word.
The last question? Last question.
My last question is, basically, what's your last word? Basically, you looking forward, to what extent do you think we will get to that kind of Star Trekian world eventually here, despite all the kind of angst around there? And not so much literally way out there 200 years from now, but do you really think we can actually achieve this technology in a way, from you three brothers, that's going to be really as profound as these last two revolutions? Give us your final
here's my
words
last word. I'm not a social change activist organization builder. I'm I like writing toolpath internals, but seeded what became 1,000 Fab Labs, doubling a year and a half with maybe 100 people using each, so say 100,000 people so far. And so the point of it is, I thought the technology roadmap I showed you was hard. Actually, it's going along just fine. We have a lot of work to do, we're not done. That's sort of my day job. We'll do the 1,000 million billion trillion. What I neglected was, we tried to work with nonprofits, but they don't do speculative technical risk, and we had to spin off a Fab Foundation. We tried to work with schools, they don't do distributed networks, we had to start a Fab Academy. Every step of the way, we found this breaks incumbent organizations. So the technical roadmap is doing just fine, and it's doubling, it really is doubling. The thing that I hadn't counted, which is why I went through this painful process of the book, is if anybody can make anything, how you live, learn, work, play completely gets turned on its side, and the segregation of business, work, education, each of those means we need to really reinvent. It's easy to find the innovators to make this stuff. Finding the innovators to make the new kinds of organizations, that's really hard.
Love it.
I often wonder what this book would be like if we had a sister. I think it would have been a lot better. But we didn't, so we had to struggle through that. You know, a lot of people ask the question, say, oh, is that Star Trek replicator going to happen? And they don't really think about all the decisions individually and collectively we're making along the way that will shape who made that replicator, how you manipulate it, where it comes from. We're making those decisions now. So to me, if you race too far ahead and you take away the agency of all of us right now to address all of these concerns, all of which are real, then we're going to have a real problem. And that replicator may be controlled by one company, and that wouldn't be a good thing.
No.
So just as a very final word, the whole idea of this digital acceleration began in Neil's Center for Bits and Atoms. There's a woman there, Sherry Lassiter, who heads the Fab Foundation.
Sorry, not the whole idea, just the version we talked about. Lots of people, including at this event, contributed to it.
You think there were other people involved, yes.
I just want to clarify, you're talking about a particular corner.
Sherry was watching the set of requests for Fab Labs on her desk, and the pile kept doubling about every year and a half. And so Neil observed that, they talked about it, and the correspondence, of course, to Moore's Law. And so in the book, we describe what we're describing as the doubling of digital fabrication as Lass's Law.
Because we call Sherry Lassiter Lass. And she runs the Fab Lab network.
So our dad loved puns, particularly bad puns. And so the final word, which is really, in a sense, the book in 3 words, which is Lass is more.
Let's give him a